TM space is what I call it.
Still a little bit out of frame, Jenny.
Really? Should I go on the other side of him?
No, you just need to lean in a little closer.
Okay, I'm gonna do this.
Is this how we're going to do the interview?
Oh, yeah.
Orthodox.
It seems to
Kids
work
love
for
it.
people.
Yeah.
You rolling? First speeding? Sound speed.
Today is May 9th, 2017. My name is Jenny Matz, and it is my honor to be interviewing
What?
Larry Wilmore
That's me.
for the Interviews, an oral history project of the Television Academy Foundation and the Writers Guild Foundation
I'm all about that oral history, y'all.
in North Hollywood, California.
Speeding, sound speed. Need to clap.
Speeding. Okay,
Great. Thank you so much for being here today, Larry.
my pleasure.
We are really going to start at the beginning. Can you tell us when and where you were born and your name at birth?
I was born in Los Angeles, California, at I believe it was John Wesley Hospital. I don't think it's there anymore. I had nothing to do with the removal of the hospital, the shutting down. 1961. My name is Elister Larry Wilmore III, so named after my father, who was the second, and lived in Los Angeles for about a year, and then my family moved out to Pomona, California in 1962, which is where I grew up.
And what did your parents do, and what was your mother's name?
My mother's name, Betty Ruth Anderson, was her maiden name. Betty Ruth Wilmore, I guess her married name. My father was a probation officer at that time, worked for the LA County Sheriff's. And I think he was doing that at that time, or was about to. My memory of when I was in my first year is a bit slim. But I know he did that during that time, yeah.
And how many siblings?
5 siblings, eventually, you know, nice, good black Catholic family. My father was Catholic. I don't think my mother grew up Catholic. I think she became Catholic later. And yeah, I was the third. I had 2 older sisters who were born in Chicago at the time. My parents moved out to LA right before I was born. And then 3 came after me, so I'm kind of in the middle, but kind of the oldest at the same time. The oldest son, but the third child, so.
Were you raised in a strict Catholic household?
I don't know what strict Catholic means.
Very Catholic.
But no, not really. My father became more of a strict Catholic later in life. During that time, I mean, we went to church and all that stuff, and eventually went to Catholic school. Early on, we went to public school. I think starting in the 5th grade, we started going to Catholic school when I was in the 5th grade. But yeah, you know, when you grow up in something, it just seems normal that that's what people do. But I soon realized once I started going to Catholic school and we would walk home from school, that kids found it odd that we went to, as they called it, that Catholic school. Because we wore uniforms and the kids at public schools didn't have to wear uniforms, you know. So early on, there was this sense that we were doing something different and kind of outside of what everybody else was doing.
What about you in terms of just being different? How would your family have described you as a kid?
One of my nicknames when I was growing up was the Professor. I was very much, I was like a really good student. I loved learning, I loved reading, very nerdy in that way. At that time, I was really big into science. I wanted to be an astronaut. I couldn't get enough of the space program. Every lunch, I would be up watching it with my eyes real big. You know, that's one of my early heroes was Walter Cronkite, because I would always watch those launches that he would cover. And I was fascinated with everything science and that kind of world. And kind of early on, I was in this thing called the Indian Y Guides. It was kind of like a Cub Scouts thing. You know, in our politically correct world, I don't think that could exist today. But actually, it celebrated the Native American culture at the time, you know, and it was a way for fathers and sons and stuff to coalesce like the Cub Scouts was. It was that type of thing. And there was a meeting, and a guy did a rope trick. You know, he cut a rope in half, and he tied it up, and he slid the knot on the rope, and he took it off. And my little brain was like, "What? What is that?" You know, and it just fascinated me, and I racked my brain until I figured out how I thought it was done, and I got hooked on magic at the time at a very early age, and that was my first kind of introduction into the performing arts, was discovering the world of magic. You know, before that, even though I was young, I felt like it was, like I loved science and all that stuff, but I also loved sports. I was kind of like in both of those kind of two worlds. My father played college football, and he was a big sports fan, and you know, I loved that world. I was a good athlete growing up, you know, as well, and I loved track and field and things like that. And but magic did something different to me. It created a whole different world that I didn't expect. You know, this performing world.
What was your exposure to magicians and magic?
I didn't have an exposure to magicians really, except that, but I was fascinated by just tricks, you know, and just the effect that it had on people, and just what happened when you fooled somebody, you know, and the reaction and the way that my brain worked. Because keep in mind, I had a very scientific brain, and I loved the process of how magic tricks worked, and there was so many different elements of it that were kind of related to science. There was this discovery, there was this mystery about it, you know. There was something happening that most people feel shouldn't happen, and that's kind of what happens. And it's funny because I'm going back thinking about this. That's kind of how scientific discoveries work, you know, where people think it's magic at first, you know, and then it turns out to be something real. So, you know, looking back, knowing that I was into that world and how magic kind of connected to it, I can see why it overlapped. But I just couldn't get enough of it, you know, just everything from making a coin vanish to, I saw this magician on TV doing the cups and balls, where these balls would disappear into cups, and I made my own and fooled my parents with it, and it was such a proud moment for me. And they bought me a magic set for Christmas, I think, that year, and I've been hooked ever since. Every day of my life, almost without fail, I'll have a deck of cards in my hand, and I will be doing something with it.
So were you performing theatrically as well as a kid? Were you interested?
Not really. As a kid, it's funny, we used to perform for our parents, like all of us. For some reason, my dad had us as a little performing troupe for him. We would just put on shows for our parents. I never thought of it in a different sense, like that is a profession or something that you did. It was just a fun thing to do for our parents, you know. And my brother and I, we used to do impressions of people and that kind of stuff and make fun. And my sisters and all, we used to love learning all the new dances and everything. We would have like shows where we'd all do some dancing and routines and stuff like that. And it was just fun. It was just something we all liked to do. And I always remember though, my father, he had one of those big reel-to-reel tape recorders. And he made this tape of us, like we were doing this skit, which we called The Great Train Robbery or something like that. And they did this kind of thing back in the day. I heard it, some people do it, but I didn't know it at the time. I thought my father had invented it. But it was very inventive, where we would do something and then he would interject a song, and then something else would happen and he'd interject like a clip from a song, you know. Like for instance, it's like, all right, lady, you gotta give me your money. He says, I don't have any money. Okay, and then he'd play the song, well, first I look in the purse, you know. And then we go to the next thing, and it was the most hilarious thing. And I thought, this is so inventive, you know, to do something like that. And it's funny that I think I got my interest in showbiz kind of accidentally and inexplicably from my dad, because he had an interest in some of these things. He was an amateur photographer. He had not so much when we were growing up, but he told me that he did have a dark room at one point and he would develop his own pictures. But he not only had that interest in the reel-to-reel and making things like that, but he had a movie camera also, which was film in those days, 8mm, that kind of thing. And I remember him sitting at the table and splicing some film together, and I found that fascinating, you know. I'm so like, what are you doing here? And to me, I saw that almost as a magic trick itself, you know, and I was thinking, how could you make someone disappear on film? So, oh, you could pause the film, they could get out of there, and then you could keep it going, and then they would vanish. And I had my father shoot this thing where I was like going to hug somebody, and then I disappeared and that type of thing. And so I learned I think that was kind of my introduction to filmmaking in a sense, you know, and that type of thing.
Interesting. Were you also watching television during this
Oh,
time? Were you-
God. I was a
Well-
huge television addict.
Tell me what some of your favorite
I
shows
loved television growing up. Television was this magic thing. I knew television. I knew what time everything was on television. I was a walking TV guide. I could tell you the times things were on, the channel. You know, I don't know why I loved it so much, but I just couldn't get enough of it. I had many different favorite shows at different ages. If I really think back, the earliest show I can remember thinking was cool was The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I remember, I think the title I found it just sounded cool as get The Man from U.N.C.L.E. What is that, you know? And it just seemed like this cool spy show and that type of thing. And then after that, it was Get Smart, I remember, became one of my favorite shows because I just couldn't believe how funny it was, you know? And that people could do things that funny and silly on television. And Don Adams, you know, he had that voice. Hello, Chief, you know. And his voice was just so funny to me, you know. And I couldn't get enough of that show. Those are my youngest memories of television, you know. But I can remember what television even felt like in those days. Like I remember we had a black and white TV at the time, and then when we first got a color TV, it seemed like this fascinating world had opened up. I remember seeing Batman, that TV show, in color for the first time, and what that felt like. Seemed so exciting, you know. Seeing a show like Batman in prime time was the coolest and funnest thing as a kid. And I was, of course, fascinated by shows like Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie because it had magic in the show, you know, where people vanished and appeared, and I always thought that was interesting. And like every other kid, you were in love with Elizabeth Montgomery and Barbara Eden and those people, you know. And my first feeling of pride, I think, of watching TV came when Flip Wilson came on the air, you know. This was the first time I saw a black person have a TV show that was like a hit, you know, considered a thing to have. I mean, before I was born, you know, Nat King Cole had a show and it was canceled, you know, and it was a very popular show because they couldn't, the people in the South didn't, you know, were boycotting sponsors or something like that. But to see Flip Wilson became the funniest person in the world to me when I was a kid, and I couldn't get enough of him. I imitated him all the time. I remember he had a book that came out, and I remember reading that book like 1,000 times, you know. And I was obsessed with Flip Wilson. It was my first kind of obsession in showbiz. I've had different obsessions over the years where I learned everything I could about that person, and Flip Wilson was that first person at the time.
Now, did that make you think, like, I see someone who looks like me on TV, and they're doing things that I like to do? Did that make you ever think that this could be a career path?
It's funny. It's the first time I thought of performing as something that would be fun to do, but I didn't extrapolate it as a career, you know. But at the time, keep in mind, I liked doing a lot of different things, and I always have. You know, there wasn't one particular thing. Like when I saw Flip Wilson and I imitated him, I wasn't thinking, boy, I'm gonna have my own show. Like I didn't put that together. It was just fun to do that and to make people laugh, you know? And I think even to this day, I've always treated what I do as an expression that I like more than a goal of getting something, you know? So, like, I like making people laugh, you know, and I like, you know, I love watching that kind of stuff, you know, I have different interests that just fuel me and that type of thing. But it was the first time I remember consciously performing to really make people laugh by doing impressions of Flip Wilson. You know, that is definitely the first time I remember that.
Now, you went to Cal State Polytech. Were you doing you were studying theater, is that right, when you were there?
In college, yes.
Yeah.
I was a theater major, you know, by the time I got to college. At that point, by the time I was in school, I was definitely thinking that this could be a career path. Okay. And you know, learning all I could about the arts. At that time, I wasn't sure really what I wanted to do in the business. I really was studying to be what I called a serious actor and everything. I was nominated for actually the Irene Ryan Acting Award for playing Tiresias in Oedipus. And I studied Shakespeare. One of my favorite memories of college is when the Royal Shakespeare Company visited us and some people from the National Theater. And God, it was such an amazing week. And I just became glued to those people, you know, and I just wanted to just soak in everything they had to say. I was such this little cipher, just wanting all this stuff, and but I was very much interested in being an actor at that time, you know, and wanting to learn all that I could. But at the same time, I still had somewhat of an interest in stand-up. I just didn't know if I could do it, you know, and I loved comedy and wanted to do it. Before I got into, well, let's see, my first year in college, I actually went up, oh, let me go back. While I was still in high school, I auditioned for the Gong Show, actually.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I did. The original Gong Show with Chuck Barris as the host. Because a friend of mine who was in high school was on the Gong Show. And he eventually became a writer in showbiz later on and everything, but he was kind of a prodigy at the time. He was a very funny writer and had written a lot of stuff, and he became my best friend in high school, and we used to hang out all the time and make each other laugh. And he was the first person that made me think that you could actually do this for a living, that there was a shot of doing that, you know, because he had kind of broken through at such a young age and had met certain people and everything. He became friends like with people like Marty Feldman and Norman Steinberg and Mel Brooks, and I'm like, how did this happen, you know? And he was just one of the funniest people that I knew, and he was so inventive, you know. But he kind of gave me confidence that if this was something you wanted to do, you probably could do it. Like, it didn't seem that far-fetched that you could get into the business, you know.
Did you have an act?
No. I did a lot of impressions at that time, and when I went to audition for the Gong Show, I think I did an actual Rich Little routine that from one of his albums or something. It was called The Great Train Robbery, where he did all these people on this train, and I think I just did that, not knowing that you're not supposed to do somebody else's routine, you know. I was just this naive. Yeah, and he had all these voices like Walter Brennan, you know, things like, God dang it! You know, I still remember some of that stuff. And, you know, I was just an innocent little kid. I went down, I remember took the bus, went down to Hollywood, auditioned for it, never heard from them or anything, but it was fun to do, you know.
It didn't dissuade you that you didn't get on?
Well, I don't think I thought anything of it. By the time I got into college, like I said, I was a theater major, and I was coming into Hollywood to take private acting classes while I was taking acting in school and studying theater and playwriting and all that stuff. But at the same time, I didn't give up my dream of doing stand-up. Now, I remember lying my way into the Comedy Store saying I was older than I was so I could go up and open mic night, because I think you had to be 21, I think, to get into the club. And I tried their open mic night, and I did a hodgepodge of stuff, a couple of impressions and some other stuff. And I killed the first night. I got like huge laughs. I'm like, oh my God, this is fantastic. And they asked me to come back, you know, and I came back like a few weeks later, and I remember I was sick as a dog. You know, I had like the flu, and I just felt horrible, and I went on stage and I completely bombed. It was like a completely different experience, and no one talked to me this time. It was like I didn't even exist. And it's funny, I felt both the high and the absolute low of what stand-up can do, and actually kind of a metaphor for showbiz in general, you know, of how that feels. And it kind of discouraged me for a little bit to go back and try that. I kind of buried my interest more in theater and that kind of stuff for a while.
Now, you didn't graduate from Polytech, right?
Right.
You left to do stand-up full-time?
Well, I initially left to, I was hired at the Mark Taper Forum to be part of the improvisational theater project. It was, we wrote this play through improvisation and kind of toured it around schools and everything. It was this theater troupe. And it was something on a fluke I just auditioned for. My head of my department had heard about it and said, hey, Larry, this might be something interesting. You might want to look into it. And I was like, okay. And once again, being the naive kid, like I didn't have a headshot, I didn't have resume, I didn't have any of that. I just went down there. I think he made a call and got me an audition. And you had to do everything. You had to move, you had to do a monologue, you had to sing, you had to do all this stuff. And I remember doing a monologue and the guy, or I was doing a scene, and the guy I was doing it with, I remember I went over and I picked him up and I threw him on the ground. You know, it's this thing with all this energy. And I remember them saying, boy, Larry, that was really good, but do you know you just threw the producer on the ground? I was like, oh, shit, sorry. But they were very nice. And this is how naive I was. I was like, they were like, so Larry, how can we contact you if we're interested? I said, well, I think I'm going to be out of town this weekend, so I don't really have a phone. Just give me your number and I'll just call you on Monday and you can tell me. Well, I didn't know that you're not supposed to do that. And so they gave me their number. Can you believe this? I didn't have anything, you know. And I was auditioning for the part of an understudy for the equity part, you know. And I remember I was out of town that weekend, and on Monday I remember, oh, I'm supposed to call these people, and I called them. I said, hey, yeah, this is Larry, just wondering what's going on. They said, well, Larry, we were really impressed by you, but we decided we're not going to offer you the understudy part. And I said, oh, that's okay. I had a lot of fun. Thanks. I appreciate it. I said, no, we want to give you the equity part, the lead in this, you know, one of the leads. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Okay, great. You know, and that's how I kind of broke into showbiz, really, was getting that part at the Mark Taper Forum. Unbeknownst to me, the person who left that role had just gotten a film. It was in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And he was actually a friend of mine, and I didn't know that he was in it, and it was Forrest Whitaker. Forrest Whitaker and I were friends at the time. He had gone to Cal Poly for a bit, but I had met him before he went to Cal Poly. We did this kind of roadshow thing that a friend of ours put together where we travel around doing monologues, and I did a comedy skit, and it was this weird kind of thing, and that's how I met Forrest. I know, it sounds bizarre. I don't even know. It's hard to even explain what it was, you know. And we became friendly, and then Forrest went to USC and to study there, and then he got the part in Fast Times. But I didn't know he had that part at the Forum, at the Mark Taper, and had left it. And then I took his part. Actually, it was kind of interesting.
Still no agent?
No agent, nothing, none of that stuff. And but I became a professional actor, and I made the decision to leave school at that time because I thought, you know what, this is what I want to do. You know, I think it's time to just make that leap.
Now, how did you make the next leap to stand-up, which was the next iteration? Right?
Yes, so I've made different leaps in my career, and I've made them at different times strategically. So at this point, even though I had made the decision to be a professional, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, right? I had no plan or anything. But I knew that I didn't just want to be an actor, that I wanted to try stand-up again. And so before I jumped back into stand-up, I got an audition. Okay, let me go. I don't know how much I'm supposed to talk in this. So there are little details I remember as I go. Like, I don't know how interested people are in a lot of these
People are very
details.
interested, especially in how you got the first break.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Then I'll talk about this. Okay, so my friend who had started in the business, he was a writer and everything at the time. I'm trying to remember the order of this so I have it right. Okay, let me go back a little bit. I remember that I got an audition for a new show for a pilot called AKA Pablo.
Weird.
I believe it was normally, right? Yeah. So I actually read for that pilot. And, here's how I got the audition. A friend of mine was writing some scenes for possibly, they were going to have, this is I think in 1983, and they were going to have a festival in Los Angeles for the Olympics the following year, and they were getting like a theater festival or something like that. And there were some scenes that people were writing, and my friend wrote a scene, and I did a scene with Michael Richards, who was, I think, on Fridays at the time. And it was so much fun, and I killed in it too. I got huge laughs, and a lot of people came up to me afterwards. Danny Simon, Neil Simon's brother, I'll never forget, said, "You were hilarious. You're so funny." I'm like, "Oh my God, it's Danny Simon," you know. And I got so much attention from it. And one of the people who came up to me worked on The Facts of Life and asked if I would, remembered me and called me in to do an audition at the time. And I'm trying to get the order of this right. I think I auditioned for AKA Pablo first. I think this person introduced me to the casting director. And it was a pilot, and I didn't make it, but I remember I couldn't believe that I got in there. And then I got an audition to be on The Facts of Life, and I was reading for the part of Tootie's boyfriend, who was supposed to be this illiterate football player. And they really liked me a lot, and they said, "Larry, we really like you a lot, but we just don't believe that you're illiterate." And I thought it was very flattering, And then later on, they called me back to play the part of a cop. Yeah. And
Officer Zeakis.
Officer Ziakis, right,
Yeah.
which I have a story about that later on. And so I said, okay, and they kind of offered me the role, really, and I did 2 episodes of it, and it was amazing. You know, I couldn't believe I was acting on television now, you know.
That was your first time on television.
That was my first time acting on television and acting with Charlotte Rae, and she was just great, and I was already a fan of hers. I remember she was on the Rich Little specials, you know, because I did impressions, so whenever impressionists were on TV, and she was on that sketch show, and I mentioned to her a sketch that I liked, and she was so impressed that I knew her work and that kind of stuff, you know. And the people were so nice there. And I remember I used to go outside, it was shot at Universal, and they would have trams that would go by with people, and I remember going out and yelling, hey, and I would just like kind of wave at the tram, that kind of stuff. Hey, how's it going? Hey, people. and I remember Tony Danzig came in once, and we were rehearsing, and he said, and they all knew him. Hey, Tony, how's it going? You know, famous from Texas. What are you doing? Yeah, I'm doing this pilot for this new show. You know, it's called Who's the Boss? I don't know what it is. You know, it's this thing I'm gonna do. And you know, sure enough, it became one of the biggest hits on television. I remember him talking about it then. And I remember seeing Janet Jackson walking on Universal. Sherman Hemsley was doing the Jeffersons. I was so like, I couldn't believe that I was in this world and everything.
I mean, you grew up right outside of LA, but this is really Hollywood. I mean,
This
you're
is
on a
really
set.
Hollywood.
Yeah.
And even before this happened, I remember I used to sneak on the Universal a lot. I remember my father took us to Universal Studios tour when I was little, and that's when Land of the Giants was on TV. And I remember they had all these things, you know, going on that tour was so interesting to me as a kid, and seeing how things worked and all that kind of stuff. I'll never forget that. And later on in college, my friend and I, we used to sneak onto the Universal lot, and we would dine and dash out of the commissary. I can't believe we did that, actually. But one of my best memories of that, though, is sneaking into the Alfred Hitchcock Theater and just sitting in the back of that theater and watching people edit films and stuff. And that's one of the things that I used to do, was just sit back there. No one knew I was there, and I would just see this editing of something going on there. And I was just watching it, you know. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I've told that story, but this was my early days, sneaking onto movie lots. Paramount, I used to sneak onto that lot. So when I got the chance to actually work there, I was like, I used to sneak on these places.
Now I got a spot.
I know, it's kind of interesting. Now, it's funny, so when I did The Facts of Life, I remember specifically changing lines while I was doing it, and not knowing that you probably shouldn't do that, you're a guest actor. But I kept getting laughs by my improvised and ad-libbed additions, like I would add a little something to it or that type of thing. And they never slapped my hand for it, and I just didn't know, I was ignorant. But I realized I liked making something funnier, you know, or improving a line, you know. I had a good sense of what a joke was already at that time, you know. And, you know, I was just a lover of comedy already, and I had done my own study of people like the Marx Brothers and, you know, all the classics and everything, and I could tell if something could be funnier, you know. I just, you know, just had that instinct. So I would go on auditions, I remember, and I would do some of that in auditions, and it wasn't looked kindly upon, you know, even though I would get laughs. But I realized, okay, I should do more with this, and that's when I decided to get back into stand-up and just do this for myself rather than changing other people's material, you know. And I jumped back into stand-up at this time. This is 1983, 84, and decided to do it full-time. And that's when I went down to the Newport Beach Laugh Stop, because at the time my father was changing careers. He decided he wanted to be a doctor, and you know.
That's like a huge leap
It's
from
ridiculous.
probation officer to
Yes,
doctor.
I know, it was crazy. And at that time he was at UC Irvine, so I was just sleeping on his floor at that time in the living
Were they
room.
supportive of this decision for you to be just a comedian?
They had no idea what
Oh.
was going on with me. They thought, whatever, you know, yeah, you should have something to fall back on, you know, and trying to be nice about it. But I always thought, well, I don't see my life as a series of fallbacks. I see it as a series of spring forwards, you know. And I thought I should jump passionately into the thing that I want to do, you know, not rely passively on the thing that I don't want to do. You know, I didn't view my life that way. One of the inspirations for that, I talked about this in a piece that I wrote for LinkedIn last year. One of the seminal moments in my life of clarifying doing what I want to do for a living. I sold bookstore to door when I was in college. And I went into so many people's homes where I could see that the people weren't happy, they weren't satisfied with their lives, they felt kind of stuck and that type of thing. And it just clarified to me that regardless of what happens in my life, just choose something that's going to bring me happiness and fulfillment. Doesn't matter how much money I make, doesn't matter what my situation is, but if I do that, then I can at least generate happiness for myself, you know, because I don't want to be like what I'm seeing right now. And it was a real clarifying moment. So it didn't, even though I didn't know what was going to happen to me in showbiz, I felt I was a success the moment I decided to do it. At that moment, I considered myself a success. Success was never a destination for me. I arrived at the moment I decided I was going to do that. And it was such a clarifying thing because I never had the anxiety of success in my bones. Like people would say, Larry, why are you so calm? I'm like, what do I need to be nervous about, you know? But that doesn't exist in me, the anxiety to be successful, because I considered myself a success the moment I decided to do this for a living and to follow my passion and to do the thing that made me happy. And I tell people, I have not worked in over 30 years because I don't consider this work. I consider it, well, it's my life's work in some ways, you know. But
The this changes though. The this is that makes you happy. The this is not really definable, right? Like stand-up, writing, acting. That's what's interesting too.
Well, it's the expression. So when I go back to when I was a kid, it's the expression of creating and making people laugh and that type of thing that brings me happiness and fulfillment. And it can take on different forms. It can be in stand-up, it can be in producing, it can be in writing, it can be in mentoring. It can be in so many different forms, but that expression is what brings me fulfillment in my life. And recognizing that was the thing that I considered made me a success. So it wasn't making any kind of money, it wasn't being in any kind of position, it wasn't having material things, it was being able to have that expression as a means, as my profession, which made me a success.
Can you talk a bit about your comic influences and how you honed your comedic voice?
Sure. So I always have liked a lot of different things, as you know, like I say, just knowing from what I like. And the same thing holds true in comedy. I was influenced from everybody from Johnny Carson to Buster Keaton to the Marx Brothers to Richard Pryor to, as I say, Flip Wilson to Jackie Gleason to Monty Python, Mel Brooks. There were so many different types of comedy. Funny was just funny to me, but I loved absurdist comedy. I loved character comedy. I like observational human comedy. One of my favorite shows of all time was Candid Camera, because I found it so funny because it's about behavior, and behavior to me is always funny. And I'll never forget one of the favorite things that I saw was they had rigged it so this guy, he was trying to teach his wife how to bowl, and they rigged it so whenever she would bowl, she would get a strike, you know. And he's very excited in the beginning. He's like, oh, honey, okay, just do this. Just do what I say, and just do this, and it'll be great, you know. So she does it, you know. In those days, she did what her husband said, right? And she bowls a strike, and he's like, that's great, honey, look, you did exactly what I said. That's great, so just do that, and it'll be great. So she bowls again, she gets another strike. He goes, look at that, you got 2 in a row, see, this is great. Bowls again, she gets another strike. He goes, wow, 3, what are the odds of that? Bowls again, gets another strike. He's like, man, whoa, you know. Bowls again, gets another strike. Now it's not feeling so good to him, you know. Now it's like, Cut to like the 9th frame, and she bowls another strike, and you see him just sitting there like this. It's like, this is what you wanted. What's wrong with you? He couldn't take it. He couldn't take that she got so good, and now she was better than him, and now she's a little superior. And I thought, that's fascinating to me. It was all behavior, you know, it wasn't scripted, it was anything. And behavior is something that I think is at the root of what I like to do in comedy, you know, is explore behavior and why people do the things they do, and you know, human interactions and all that kind of stuff, you know, and it's kind of at the root of my comedy in a lot of different ways, you know. So those are kind of my influences. I became obsessed with different people at different times. When I was in high school, I had a huge obsession with the Marx Brothers. I could not get enough of the Marx Brothers. Whenever they were on TV, I would watch it. Had a little tape recorder. I would memorize it. I remember I had this minor surgery when I was in high school, and they were putting me under, and I'm reciting the entire movie of Animal Crackers as I'm going down, doing all the voices and everything. How long have you fellas had it? All that. Well, we get it $10 an hour. Huh? How much do you get for not playing? $12 an hour. Well, cut me off a piece of that, as I'm going under. And just learning, and I was fascinated at the time. I wanted to learn why people got famous and what made it, and I wanted to learn everything about the Marx Brothers. And then in college, it became Buster Keaton was kind of my obsession, because I didn't know much about Buster Keaton. A friend of mine was a film buff, and he would screen his 16mm films at his house. He got this film collection of Buster Keaton, and every time he'd get a new one, we'd have a screening and we'd watch it. This is pre-VHS days and all that kind of stuff, So that was another thing, I just wanted to learn everything about him. So over the years, I've had different comic obsessions and just poured all that into my world and kind of became part of my bones, as well as just loving everything else that was out there. Saturday Night Live was a big influence when it first came on. There was just nothing like it on TV. I couldn't believe you could say the things that they were saying on TV. The dangerousness of that comedy kind of appealed to me and appealed to my brain and that type of thing. So all those things were influences to me.
How would you describe your act?
Okay, so when I decided I wanted to do stand-up comedy again, I approached it not as a wide-eyed amateur hoping to get the approval of somebody in a room. I approached it from a professional point of view. I spent 8 to 10 hours a day just writing jokes, and I did that every single day. And I would find an open mic night, and I would go up and try it out and try things out. I would wait in line, and I did all that stuff, And I was a comedy bum at the time, just trying to get on stage. And so one of the first jokes that I did that got like a laugh that I felt was the correct kind of laugh, that this joke can now stay in the act and be a part of it. It was actually some impressions, and it sounds so weird now. And I still feel it's kind of a classic joke for me, and it's all about behavior too, which is interesting. But it's an intersection between behavior and politics, And at the time, I never really considered myself political, really. But I had always been interested in news and politics. I was kind of a news junkie growing up, but I never really thought about it. Like I said, Walter Cronkite was one of my heroes. And I remember when the whole Watergate thing happened, I was fascinated during that summer of just watching all those hearings on TV. It was just fascinating to me and all that kind of stuff. But I never considered myself a political person. I thought I was funny and all this stuff, and even racial observations and all those things were funny to me, but I never thought of myself as an activist or having that kind of bone. But my first piece was a political piece, which is kind of interesting. And my observation was that all politicians lie. The only one that didn't was George Washington. His father asked him if he chopped down the cherry tree. He said yes. I said, but what if other politicians had chopped down the cherry tree? This is like a typical setup, Like if Richard Nixon had chopped down his father's cherry tree. I said, Richard, come here, did you chop down my tree? I was, well, Daddy, looking in retrospect, I can firmly say that although I did authorize the initial break-in of the tool shed, I must say that in no significant way links me to the actual chopping. That got a big laugh because Nixon and all that stuff. And then I think I did Carter. Well, Daddy, I chopped it in my heart. I didn't chop it. And Reagan, well, there you go again. But I would end it with Jesse Jackson, and this got a huge laugh because Jesse was running at the time and everything. He said, Jesse, come here. Did you chop down my tree? Well, Daddy, the question is not whether or not I chopped down your tree, as much as do I believe in the tree's right to exist. On that point, Daddy, furthermore, Daddy, I believe in the rights of all trees. I think it is wrong to merely address the plight of the cherry tree alone. There's the apple tree, there's the orange tree, there's the fig tree. They have been locked out of the garden. Daddy, we have to include all the trees into the garden, along with the rose bush, along with the grass, along with the weeds, in order to form a total shrubbery coalition, you know. And I got a huge applause. I remember people, whoa, man, you did Jesse Jackson. And I was like, man. So that was the first piece that I wrote for my new stand-up career, along with the other jokes. And I thought, wow, that's a professional joke, it felt like to me, you know.
Yeah.
And it's funny, when I lecture these days, I call back to that, and I do, and it still gets the applause that it used to get back then. It still gets big laughs, even though it's a, you know, now it's an homage, ironic Nixon impression, you know, which is kind of funny these days, you know. But that told me that I was on the right track. That, okay, Larry, if you can write a joke like that, then you're doing the right thing. It wasn't me memorizing Rich Low's impression routine or doing stupid jokes that I had done before. Now this was something different. This was really a point of view that was my point of view, that was interesting. It was my take on something, you know. And so I started just writing things that I thought was funny and trying to discover things. And stand-up is that type of thing. You're trying to discover who you are while you're doing it. There's a little bit of imitation when you first start out and you're not sure. But what I would do is, you know, I would try out everything, and jokes that got this kind of laugh would stay in, and any jokes that didn't match the jokes that were here would get weeded out of the act. So you'd have a lot of stuff in because you needed something, but anytime you got a new joke in that got here, you could get rid of the joke that was down here. That's how I kind of viewed my act, you know.
Very methodical.
Yeah, but after about a year, I had a pretty solid, like, 15-minute act of stuff that was up here. So I could get gigs of being an opener and that kind of stuff in clubs and stuff. It's kind of how I started in stand-up, you know. But my act was a real hodgepodge of things because I just put in things that made me laugh. I didn't really have a point of view for the act. I wasn't a storyteller. I didn't talk about my childhood, that type of stuff. They were just kind of random things. And some were absurdist because I like that stuff. Some were political, like that. Some were...
Black away.
Yeah, some were like commercial parodies. I did a parody, like a commercial parody. Like suddenly I'm acting doing a commercial. So that's a weird thing of a product called Blackaway, where it takes the black out of your voice. So you could, you know, you could get things done over the phone and that kind of stuff, so people don't know that you're black. You know.
I mean, the premise just got to laugh. So.
Yes, exactly. Revolutionary new Blackaway works right in the mouth to remove even the most stubborn colloquial slang. that was Blackaway. But another one of my favorite jokes from back then was, I would say, people always ask me what I'm mixed with, you know, and they give me that look. They go, "Are you, you know, mixed with something?" Like I'm a secret recipe. And so now I just tell people, look, if I was a beer, I'd be a Negro Light, okay? And I am a third less angry than the regular Negro, so it kind of works out. And that always got a big laugh, you know. And it was a true look at myself type of joke, and I always thought that's a good joke, a good identity joke, you know. But then I also did silly jokes like where I talked about language, and I said, you know, we have 26 letters in our alphabet, but I found out that Chinese people have over like 5,000 symbols. I'm like, that's too many letters. I mean, Wheel of Fortune's got to be a bitch over there. You know? It's like, because the game would take so long, and people say, okay, I'd like to buy another vowel. I'm so tired. Yeah, one more vowel. Jesus Christ. And things like that. The audience always loved that kind of stuff, you know. And then I would tie things together in weird ways too. Like I remember, this was a very bizarre, this premise doesn't mean anything. It's something that I made up, but it always got a big laugh where I said, oh guys, if you want to do, so I figured out how, I said, I like to tease my grandfather. This is a good practical joke that you guys can do. What I do, he wears a hearing aid, you know, and I get into a real good conversation with him. Then right in the middle of it, I just start talking like this. Yeah, right, I know. No, yeah, no, I know what you mean, but don't you agree? And he's like, and so, you know that face a dog makes it? And I go, it's fun. He said, and then I would say, Reagan makes that face. He said, whenever he hears a sound he's never heard of, his head stops shaking. So it's like, so then I would start doing his head and then go, compassion for the poor. You know, and that was my sneaky way of getting like a comment in by doing a silly joke. So that's kind of how my brain worked. I do a silly joke and then I link it with something that had maybe some commentary or something in a silly way. So I don't know, it's very bizarre.
Well, I mean, that's a tool a lot of comedians, I mean, you would use many years later when you were talking about very tragic situations and finding a way for comedy to weave through.
How do you make that funny?
What did you take from writing comedy for yourself? How did that translate then to writing for television for other people?
Sure. Well, while I was doing stand-up, because my brain can't stop thinking of jokes, I would have joke suggestions for friends of mine for their stand-up, you know, and I would say, hey man, you should try this, you know, and they'd go, oh great, thanks, and I would have like either, you know, punchlines that I thought might work better. This is me fixing things again, you know, or a follow-up joke that would be good, or a callback, or that type of thing. And after a while, a couple of people asked if I would write some jokes for them, and a friend of mine, David Strassman, who's a ventriloquist, asked if I would write him a couple of routines, and I thought, sure, you know, and so I ended up kind of being his writer for a few things, you know, and writing jokes for this ventriloquist, you know, it was kind of bizarre. But it taught me that it wasn't hard for me to, I mean, it was interesting. It was always harder for me to think of what was my voice than it was for someone else's. It was always more comfortable for me to put myself in someone else's point of view and write that than it was for mine. Because even though I wrote what I thought was funny, I never really thought I could settle on one particular thing that made me a particular comic, you know. And it wasn't until I almost started giving up stand-up that I started to find that, I thought, which is kind of interesting, you know. But it was easier for me to see someone else's voice, and I could write that voice very easily, you know. So it was doing that that kind of taught me that. And one of my frustrations of being a stand-up during that time, and being a stand-up who was a black comic, was I didn't fit quite in the mold, and I've talked about this many times, of what a black comic was supposed to be in Hollywood. So during this time, and this is more the late 80s, early 90s, like Def Comedy Jam was starting to be a thing. In Living Color, I remember, was just starting up, and hip hop was just kind of getting into flavor. But what was considered the black comic was somebody who usually was from the ghetto, you know, and was the fast-talking, streetwise, urban, as they said, point of view, you know, the wise Negro type of thing, you know. Or it was talking explicitly about sex in a very, you know, brash way and everything, you know. And I just wasn't like that. I was, you know, kind of an understated, absurdist political comic, you know, who had kind of a writer's stand-up act, you know, that's who I was. But I did very well in the comedy clubs. I mean, I did very well. I headlined clubs and had a huge response, but I couldn't get any attention in Hollywood for who I was. And for me, when I grew up, black comics weren't one thing. There were so many different things, you know. Like Dick Gregory was a political comic. You know, Red Fox was what you called your party records comic. It was dirty, you know. Godfrey Cambridge was more of a hipster comic, you know, at the time. Flip Wilson was like more of a vaudevillian type comic who just told classic jokes, you know. Bill Cosby was a storyteller, you know. So you had, and no one had a problem with that. Black comics back in that day didn't fit into one particular category. There was a broad range of things, just like any other comic, you know. But by this time, it was kind of ghettoized into one particular thing. Hollywood was like, no, we're happy with what we think black comics should be. Stop trying to be something else, you know. But I just wasn't that. So I came to a point where I thought, you know what, I'm gonna have to discover myself in this business. I can't wait for Hollywood to discover me, because that's never gonna happen. And that's when I decided to write and produce television, that was the way to do it, was to write something for myself rather than wait. You know, part of my inspiration was when Robert Townsend and Keenan did a Hollywood Shuffle and did their movie. So they were discovering themselves, basically, you know. Even Spike Lee, during his movies, he was discovering himself as a black filmmaker. So I thought I needed to discover myself as this different type of comic. You know.
Well, would naturally go into In Living Color here, but you actually have a credit before that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
talk about your first role writing for television on Into the Night.
So the way that I broke into television writing, once I made that decision, and this is the way that my brain works, is once I'm ready to do something, I jump into it, and I leave the other thing behind. Because I think now it's time to go into something else. So I made that decision. And it's funny, I was just starting to mature, I think, as a comic, because it takes about 5 or 6 years of doing it unless you're just immediately brilliant and you have that sense of who you are in the beginning. It's very rare. But even Richard Pryor said it takes 10 years to learn how to do stand-up comedy. And I was just getting to that 7-8 year where I was finding out who I was and I was being a little more truthful and more direct. And I remember, but I was still kind of frustrated with the business and everything, and I was torn because I thought, wow, I'm really learning how to write stand-up now. I'm getting better at it. And I could tell I was about to make some leaps, but I was, concerned about that. I had made this decision, and I'm trying to think if there's a joke that represents that. Okay, so this was the type of joke. I'll tell this story because I think this is important, because it's a good story about being knocked down a bit. So I did, Rosie O'Donnell at the time had a show called Stand Up Spotlight. And I did an episode of it, and this was during my writing transition as a stand-up. And I did a joke where I said, a lot of people compare, I said, I hate discrimination, of course, but a lot of people compare black discrimination to gay discrimination. And I'm like, it's not the same thing. I mean, we don't have to come out of the closet. It's like, Mom, Dad, I'm black. What? Well, how long has this been going on? I felt this way all my life. Bullshit, you've been hanging out with those Negroes down by the railroad, haven't you? It's like, no. And it was really funny, and I was pointing out the differences, not saying one is worse than the other. And I really enjoyed that joke because it was real point of view for where I was at the moment, There was, and I remember, and I got a real good response for the show and everything. And afterwards, Rosie O'Donnell called. And I had known Rosie before, I worked with her in the clubs, and she hated that. And she thought, that's homophobic. And I said, no, it's not, Rosie, this is my point of view. I'm speaking from my point of view. I'm not slamming one side. But she just thought it was terrible, and she wouldn't air it, and just wouldn't listen to me. And she said, she was comparing me to Andrew Dice Clay, who was at the time. I said, Rosie, you know me. I'm not like that, Why would you think that? And I was so upset about that. I remember hating her for years because of that. That was the one person I hated. I'm sure Rosie's very nice and everything, but sorry, Rosie, I hated you at that time. Because I couldn't believe she was squelching my point of view. Right. Like, how dare you, how dare you shut down my speech, and my point of view? And I couldn't believe it, And it was a real lesson at the time that, that type of thing, that somebody would do that. And I remember being so upset. And I really liked that time in my life because it made me really question even what my point of view was and what it should be and where I belong. This was a time when I started listening to conservative radio at the time. And I started reading more right and left points of view to make up my own mind about stuff, because I didn't want to just be in one particular camp of something. I wanted to make up my own mind about the world, because I found a lot of hypocrisy existing on the left during this period. And they were really related to speech and protecting speech, and that's where political correctness was just starting, And I had a problem with that, But I didn't consider myself left or right during that time. I didn't have any of these notions, It's so interesting. I like to consider things fairly,
A passionate centrist, you called yourself?
Passionate centrist, yeah, it came out of that, actually. I saw the world more in black and white than I did left and right, actually. Like, I saw the clear distinction between that, And also male and female. I always had a sense of how women were treated differently than men, too. I think it's being raised by a single mom. My parents got divorced and everything. Those were clear distinctions to me. Right and left weren't as clear. I learned what that was over that particular decade, But I think that kind of helped me want to do my own thing as well, because someone was in a position of power to quiet me. And I thought, okay, I need to be making these decisions. And ironically, at a time when my stand-up was becoming more of my point of view, I decided to do something else. Isn't that interesting, you know? And here's the irony of this story. So years later, years later, Wanda Sykes does almost that exact joke, word for word. This is almost 20 years later on Rosie O'Donnell's show. How about that?
Wow.
But the world had caught up with that point of view at that point. I did that joke in 1990, 1991.
And she's both.
Wanda Sykes did it in 2014, I think.
Do you think it mattered that she
No,
is
the world
gay?
caught, it was okay to make that
Yeah.
joke at that point, you know? But when I made it, it was not okay in her mind to make it, you know? But that was my point. I made the joke when it wasn't safe, you know? You know, and I like making jokes at times when it's not safe to make that joke, or it's provoking us to think of it, not when we're past the point when it's okay to make that joke. Like, I called the president my nigga to jump ahead at a time when it's not okay to say something like that. Not 10 years from now when we can say it. Saying it now when you're not supposed to. So I like to do that in my career, you know, to say it when you're not supposed to say it, when it's still dangerous to say it, you know. So anyhow, I'm jumping forward a little bit.
Yeah,
So-
we definitely will get there.
Yeah.
Well, so you made this conscious decision that
Yes.
you want to be in control. You want
That's
to be
exactly
able to,
right.
to have your own voice and have
I
it
want to
heard.
control content.
So explain to me how you then, again, methodically, it seems like you're
I was
very
very methodical
intentional.
about it, yes.
Why Into the Night? How did you get
Okay,
that
so
gig?
I realized, so I had to come up with a plan. So my plan was I have to break into television writing. How do I do that? So a friend of mine, Paul Zimmerman, he was dating Pam Stone at the time, who was a friend of mine. They were both friends of mine. And Paul had just started writing for Into the Night. And he was one of the people that I called, and he said, you know, they're looking for a couple people right now. I'll give you a recommendation. I'm like, great. And so he recommended me, and they had me, you had to write like 5 pages of jokes like overnight because they wanted to see how fast you could write. And well, first I sent material they liked it, but then they make you write that joke round, and I'm like, this is no problem, this is easy, you know. And I did that, and they liked me and came in and interviewed, and I got a job in Into the Night, you know. And
That easy. Seems really easy.
it seems easy, but I was very fortunate at that time. But luckily for me, I was already writing for other people, so I didn't just know how to write for myself, you know. So I already had that muscle of writing jokes, and I had trained myself over the years to write jokes every day. You know, when I had the discipline, when I had nothing going on, to write for 8 hours a day, you know, writing jokes, you know.
And these were really jokes. I mean, this was a late night talk show hosted by Rick Dees, and it was like a variety show, but he did jokes.
He did jokes. So these, I'm writing jokes that anybody can do. I call bulletproof jokes is what I call it, because they're not reliant on point of view or that type of thing. They just have to be jokes, which sometimes can be the hardest thing to do. Years later, I actually taught joke writing at Clark Atlanta. Is that the name? Is that how you say it? What is Brittany? What is it? Clark? Is it Clark Atlanta? Yeah. So using all these tools and everything, you know. It's very interesting, joke writing itself, you know. But writing jokes for no particular point of view is one of the hardest things to do, because they just have to be good jokes, you know. I find it easier to write for a point of view, because you're writing that person's point of view.
You can hear it already.
Exactly. Like if you tell me to write a Chris Rock joke, you know, a lot of it is his rhythm, you know, and you figure that out, or Jerry Seinfeld, you know, that type of thing. So a lot of it is writing their rhythm, and you get into how they think, and then you can form the joke, you know. But just to write a generic joke is very difficult, because now you're just putting an idea together that has something in it, you know. And I always say a joke is the least amount of words for the maximum amount of impact is what a good joke is, you know.
And was that part of your intention, was to bone up on your experience with that in order to get to the next place?
My first thing that I knew I had to do was to get on a show. It didn't matter what the show was. I was completely indiscriminate about that. But I thought, I don't know how to write for television. I need to learn how to do that. And I'm a big proponent of learning on the job.
Did someone mentor you at that show?
No, not at all. So I just figured, let me get into this, and at least I can learn how to do this. And so, but joke writing, at least I had been doing it for years, so I knew how to do that. So I wasn't intimidated by that. But while I was on Into the Night, I had met with an executive at 20th, Rose Catherine Pinckney was her name, who's still a good friend of mine, and she was looking for writers for In Living Color, and we just had a conversation. It was like one you call a general conversation, and I thought, man, I would love to write for In Living Color. It just started. It just had its second season or something. It had like a half of first season, became a sensation. But that to me seemed like the perfect thing. And it's funny that when In Living Color started, I couldn't get in the door to audition for it.
To perform.
Correct. Like they were not interested in me. I was not on that radar, you know. But I was able to get in the door as a writer, you know, someone who could write for that, you know. It was interesting. And she arranged a meeting for me with Keenan, and it was one of the best meetings that I ever had like that, because I just made him laugh, really, and we swapped kind of stand-up stories and that type of thing, and I submitted a couple of sketches, and he liked it, and he was very nice and hired me to write for In Living Color. And In Living Color truly was my big break. That opened up everything to me because it was a hot show, you know, it was in the cultural landscape. I learned so much about television writing on that show.
Like what?
Well, first of all, there was so much talent on that show, and I love working with talent. Talent makes you raise your bar in every single way, you know. And the writers were so good and so smart and so funny.
And diverse. It was
and diverse. Keenan hired a very diverse staff in front of and behind the camera. I mean, people from Harvard, from the world of stand-up, from Stanford. I mean, really smart writers, funny, devastatingly funny, cruel, you know, things like that, satirical, all the stuff that I loved, you know, in one place, you know. Very hard job, too. One of the hardest jobs I've ever had, because you have to pitch so much. Keenan was very demanding. And people got fired all the time. It's that type of situation. So you had to learn how to survive and all that kind of stuff. But, yeah, I knew. And at that point, and it's funny, I had a couple of auditions that the world was starting to open up to me on that other side, you know?
Seinfeld,
right when I was
right?
making this transition, I had an audition for Seinfeld, and I had 2 auditions for it, because I had Mark Hirschfeld, who I became friends with back in the Facts of Life days, actually. He used to always call me in for things. I've had angels in the business, people who, for whatever reason, liked me and just went out of their way and did things for me. And Mark Hirschfeld was one of those people over the years who, once, I don't even know if he remembers, he would call me once in a while, hey, what's going on? Because I didn't have an agent in those days. And he would call me in for stuff once in a while and that kind of stuff, you know. And yeah, and he called me in, I believe it was Mark Hirschfeld at the time, but he called me in for the Seinfeld thing and asked if I wanted to do it. And I couldn't get it. I had just started writing on that show. It was like the second week when I was doing, that's when I was doing Into the Night. And then he called me again later when I was doing A Living Color, and I just couldn't do it. And,
what was the role? Do you remember what the character was?
I remember the second one. I didn't even have to come in and read. They were just going to give me the part. I think I was in an ambulance driver or something like that. It would have been fun to do, but I knew the thing I was doing was more important at the time.
Wow, focused.
Yeah, I know.
Well, it worked out. So in Living Color, tell me a little bit about the writer's room, how you would you pitch sketches? Would you get assigned characters to write, like how would that writing room work?
No, you just pitched everything. We usually pitched on Monday morning. I remember by my second year, there was a period when we were pitching every day, which is the most exhaustive thing in the world. You had anxiety all the time, you know. It was very difficult. Keenan was very demanding. Sometimes he would clown you in the middle of your pitches, and as you write, you'd be like, ah. Like he'd have an imaginary gun, and he'd be looking in the chamber, you know, and you're pitching over there, and he'd like start putting bullets in it and that type of stuff. And then he'd take it and just shoot it. You're like, oh. And everybody's already laughing at you. You feel clowned. People would clown you all the time, but you know, if you really pitch some funny stuff, it would be appreciated. But there was everything from backbiting and, you know, clannish behavior to, you know, immature behavior and fun. I remember writing Deep Into the Night, and there was this there was one of the producers on the show, and Living Color got tons of swag and like gifts from people and stuff like that. I remember we raided her office and everything. We broke into it and we stole things like blenders and things like this that we would say. I mean, we did immature stuff like that. But I remember writing sketches at 3 in the morning with Jamie Foxx and Jim Carrey and that kind of stuff.
What are some of your favorites that you worked on?
Favorite sketches? Oh, the things that stand out to me, we did a Super Bowl special, and a lot of the things I wrote got into that special, and I was very proud of that. And I think the funnest one for that was the men on football, because it was all inappropriate double entendres, you know. But that was a lot of fun. But the show, that episode itself was just a fun experience. But the sketch that stands out to me as probably my all-time favorite was one of the first times where we did Jamie Foxx doing Wanda, and I got the idea for this particular sketch, and we had did one of these, and we were waiting to do another one, but we just didn't have an idea. But I remember, you know, like I said, you were so tense from that job and everything, and I ended up getting a massage, where the person comes to you, and you know, she had this table, and you put your head in this thing, and you can't see anything. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I thought, what if Jamie was giving someone a massage and they couldn't see what she looked like, you know, because the premise was she was so horrific. But they hear her voice and they're coming onto her and all this stuff, and then the minute he turns around, ah! You know, and it got such the biggest laugh, you know. It was one of the funnest sketches. I've rarely heard a laugh that big on stage. And Tommy Davidson was so funny. He just had these little shorts on, and Jamie like pulled them down. You could see his little butt like running around the stage and everything. It was so much fun. That's one of my fondest memories of that.
And it's interesting to me, as a performer who wouldn't have performed on the show, although your brother did.
Yes, he did later on, yeah.
Was there ever any ego involved in writing something that was so good that you just, no?
Absolutely not.
You gave it up. You just had no problem.
had a writer's ego, though. It's like, I resented when people thought they were ad-libbing and you knew that you wrote something intentionally to sound like an ad-lib and you didn't get credit for it. So I had a writer's ego for it, but never a performer's one, because I was always clear about what I was there to do. So I was never envious of wanting to do it or wishing I was the one doing it. Never had that feeling at all.
What are your sort of biggest takeaways about what you needed to learn from that show and what you did learn about comedy writing?
Well, there's just a level of funny that you have to be at if you want to make a mark, you know. There's just a bar that is up there, you know. And there's so much, you know, there's so much talent involved in it, but a lot of it is persistence and hard work and figuring things out, you know. And there's an intersection of the world and your ideas that is a sweet spot for writing things that are just interesting, you know, and finding the marriage of that, you know, to create something. So it's not just a confection of my mind, it's in my observation of the world and an investigation of myself. It's both of those things coming together, you know, to create something. Those are the big lessons that I learned out of it. And also that, you know what, there's more in there than you realize. You know, when you're forced to pitch all the time, you're just forced to invent a lot. By the time I got to sitcom writing, you know, you weren't required to come up with all the stories, but I was like, hey, wait, you just want one story? Here's 12, for Christ's sakes. Why do you just want one? I can't believe it. It seems so much easier to write sitcoms than it did writing sketch.
Yeah. And I think while you were still there, the writing team in '92, it got nominated for an Emmy, a Primetime Emmy. What did that honor mean to you, if any?
It was amazing. Once again, you just felt like, wow, you know, you can't believe that you're in that particular category. Just joining the Academy, I remember filling out that form, you know, that I was a member of the Academy, you know, just that type of thing was so impressive. And also being appreciated and being recognized for that type of work just taught me something of what it takes for excellence, the type of hard work that it actually takes for it, that it's not accidental, that it really takes grit and all of that stuff, you know, to get those types of things, you know. a good show just doesn't appear and exist. You know, somebody worked hard to figure that stuff out, you know. So yeah, that was amazing. I could not believe that happened, you know, that it happened to me. I could believe it about the show, but to believe that I was a part of it, you know.
People still reference that show all the time.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
where do you think it stands? Like, what's the legacy of In Living Color in the landscape of television?
I think it's big. I really do. In Living Color, to me, was not just a funny sketch show, but it was, first of all, it was the show in one of the shows, I have to give Arsenio Hall credit as well, to introduce hip hop to television in the mainstream, because it didn't exist on television. It just didn't, you know. To a certain extent, if you watch videos on BET, possibly, but just black people watch BET, really, you know.
Yeah, it wasn't on MTV.
No, certainly not hip hop.
Nope.
You know, they played the safe black videos on MTV by that time, you know, because Michael Jackson made that breakthrough. But it's not like they were playing NWA or, you know, Big Daddy Kane, you know, these type of people. So it introduced hip hop to the mainstream. Hip hop existed in the way the Fly Girls looked, you know, their style of dance. We had rappers at the end of our shows, you know, that people never heard of, you know, that would come on and do music. The style of dress of our performers, the style of the comedy, you know, the way it was more in your face type of thing, you know, its attack. It didn't have the subversive intellectualism of an SNL, that type of thing, or the absurdist take of Python or even SCTV. It had more of a hip hop brashness, and the intellectualism of it was rooted in a cultural take, you know. So that's what made it different. You know, it was a smart cultural take too, you know, and it was able, like you know, part of what Woody Allen was able to do, like in his career, was to mix lowbrow and highbrow, you know. And when you can do that in a form where people know they're getting something smart, but you can have a dick joke in there too, you know, you're kind of succeeding on both fronts, which is kind of nice.
We're going to take a short break.
Great.
Change tape. Do you want to get a drink or
Sure,
stretch your
I
legs?
think I'll just get some
You want to
water
get some more
here.
coffee?
I'll just throw this out there.
Okay. I can take it for you. if
I
you
can
want.
talk about this stuff for hours, guys.
sorry.
You just tell me to stop.
This